bearing in mind it's 3 years, 2 months and some since the EU referendum, what is actually likely to happen? The scandal is we really don't know, but that provides an opportunity for Newsnight to offer up 4 distinct possibilities. I'm joined now by Tom Harwood of Guido Fawkes, Polly Mackenzie, Chief Executive of Demos, Helen Thomas of Blonde Money and Political Editor of the New Statesman, Stephen Bush. Good evening to you all. But before we map out the future, let's have a quick look at today's headlines. And we begin with The Guardian there. Emotional farewell. Davidson quits as Scottish Tory leader. Senior Tories pledge rapid action to thwart no deal. Daily Telegraph, Corbyn backs call to shut down the streets is the Telegraph's front page. And the Financial Times, a picture there of Ruth Davidson. Johnson seeks to avert Commons' defeat by soothing no-deal nerves. Well, that's the headlines, and now on to tonight's events before we have a look at what you might think might happen next week. And first of all, the impact of Ruth Davidson's departure, Polly.
Well, as your video explained, those 13 Conservative MPs elected at the last election were kind of crucial to Theresa May's tiny little foothold on power. And, you know, we know that Boris Johnson's kind of no-deal, do-or-die strategy puts at risk those Conservative gains in Scotland, because Scotland voted to remain. And Ruth Davidson, popular, likeable, centrist and moderate, even though she had backed a deal, was a great figurehead that I think offered them hope.
And there's absolutely no doubt that it was mainly for personal reasons, Tom, but also there's no doubt that there was a great antipathy between her and Boris Johnson. He knocked back her idea of leaving her Scottish secretary in place. He didn't give her due for what she'd achieved in Scotland.
Well, I think she's achieved a massive amount in Scotland. I think actually there's a lot more in common with Ruth Davidson and Boris Johnson than a lot of people often give them credit for. They're both not seen as particularly politicians. They're seen as people who can really cut beyond that, and Ruth deserves an enormous amount of credit.
Yeah, but one can do things in one country and one can do things in the other, and it was thought for a while that actually Ruth Davidson should get her rucksack on and get down here.
So I think that's unlikely. She wouldn't want to be seen as a carpetbagger. Actually, it's probably quite good for her future political prospects to duck out of this fraught political moment. But she did create the Conservative Party as the Unionist Party of Scotland in a modern setting. And the challenge now will be to continue being that party of the Union. Yeah,
there's no one else to fight for the Union in Scotland, is there?
Well, they do have this sort of big structural problem, and the Labour Party is divided on how it essentially wants to move on from the constitutional question. Their difficulty is no one else in Scotland wants to move on from the constitutional question. The big problem the Scottish Conservatives have is part of what allowed Ruth Davidson to have that success is she had the Scottish independence referendum, which established her as a national figure. And with the greatest respect to the remaining Scottish Conservative members of the Scottish Parliament, none of them are national figures, and it makes it much harder to establish themselves.
Right, well, let's move on to presentations, and you were last to speak there, so you're first up.
Right, so, so the first thing, of course, I think...
This is what you think will happen or could happen next week.
Yeah, I think this is what I think is the most likely, and I think the important thing to emphasise is everything is really unlikely.
Right.
But I think the least unlikely thing is that MPs are going to try and succeed in passing some kind of law to force an extension. They've got just about enough time if they can pull off the same quickness that they did with the Cooper Act.
Nick says they're going to go for that he's going to go for 9th to prorogue.
Yeah, I think they can just about pull that off. I think then what happens is Boris Johnson does his sad face in front of Downing Street, going, "I really didn't want to have to do this. Yeah, I didn't want to have to call an election when the opposition was divided, when they'd all just teamed up to frustrate Brexit. But sadly, I'm going to have to do that. It's risky to do it, but there is no non-risky time to do it." Then what happens after that election? Maybe there's an extension. I think it's unlikely that the next Parliament is going to be better placed to withdraw it. But look, I think the important thing right here is eventually, whether it is by moving the Irish border to the Irish Sea, whether it's by having a no deal, but no deal is not an end state, as with a referendum, you end up eventually signing something which most fair-minded lawyers will look at and go, there's really very little difference between that and the withdrawal agreement that MPs rejected 3 times.
So May's deal gets through. Basically, Ruth Davidson's plea works. Vote it through.
Yeah, maybe after a couple of elections and a recession, but eventually.
Thanks very much indeed. OK, Helen Thomas, your view. You're next up.
Right, so this week, obviously, the constitutional outrage of Boris will be met by the constitutional outrage of Bercow, because to get this new law passed by the anti-no deal crew, there will need to be a bit of chicanery around parliamentary practice. But what they're going to go for is an extension. And the thing that's key this time around, compared to the extension in March, April, it is no longer costless for MPs. Both the Labour and Conservative parties have seen their support plummet since that decision was taken. Whether you are a Remainer or a Brexiteer, both sides are frustrated. So, actually, an extension, it won't pass. It was narrow last time, and it won't this time. Then they go on to their next option of a no-confidence vote. But again, this is not that clear for the anti-no deal crew. For a start, if we do not find an alternative government, which looks unlikely, there's no alternative candidate to coalesce around, you could well end up with either Boris back in power or an election that nobody really wants, despite what they say, on a date potentially after we've actually left. So that won't pass either, just some virtue signalling around it. So where we end up, after that European summit, middle of October, a lot of noise, but basically where we are today, we won't get enough of a concession from the EU to get a deal through. So October 31st, no deal, and then a general election.
Helen, thank you very much indeed. Polly, what do you think might happen?
Well, so we're all in agreement that those opposition and Remainer forces are going to work next week to try and pass a new law. But I think in the end, even though they're more united now than they have been in 3 years, they're not going to succeed. They're going to be outmanoeuvred just about by the forces in Downing Street, which means that instead they will succeed in calling a general election through the vote of no confidence. What's going to happen in that general election? We've seen the Conservatives...
So they're going to win the vote of no confidence?
Yeah, they'll be able to bring down the government instead, because in the technicalities of passing a new law are much more difficult than a single vote, which is the vote of no confidence. And as people get more and more kind of panicked and desperate, unfortunately, they will trigger a general election which resolves literally nothing about this state of chaos we're in, because at the end of the general election, we'll have yet another hung parliament, perhaps just as hung as the current one, slightly more, I don't know. But we're going to get to the 30th of October, and the only way to stop no deal, the one single swift tool that they have in their armoury remains the nuclear button. They'll just revoke Article 50 and we're back to square one.
Thank you very much indeed. Tom.
Right, so I think we're absolutely all agreed the strategy that Remainers in Parliament are going to attempt is not to go for to go for the legislative route rather than the no confidence route, in terms of them not feeling that the no confidence has credibility in terms of delivering a unity figure. So they're going to go for a new law, but they're up against a much more activist number 10 than Theresa May's administration. And they're going to find themselves outmanoeuvred and not be able to get that new law even proposed. And that means they fall back onto their second option of a confidence vote. That confidence vote is now facing a very activist number 10. It's facing a very bold number 10. And without a unity figure to deliver an alternate government within that 14-day period following a confidence vote, they're going to hear Boris Johnson say, if you vote no confidence in me, I'm calling an election, and that election will be in November, after no deal. So ultimately, that no confidence vote will fail because it's a surefire way to deliver no deal. Then we get into the recess, into the prorogued period, where actually Boris achieves a new deal. The EU knows he's serious about no deal, knows the only way to avert it is to get a deal that's credibly going to pass through Parliament. So that's proposed by the EU. It returns, it passes through Parliament, and at that point, we leave at the end of October with a deal. There's a general election and a stonking Tory majority.
And you live happily ever after. OK, do come and sit down. And let's take it straight back to the New Deal. This New Deal, what's this New Deal, this new law, how's it going to comprise? Well,
there's going to be a total backstop-ectomy.
Okay.
Boris Johnson's going to be successful in getting rid of that backstop from the deal. But also there's sort of the niggles that people really have around the single customs territory, around regulatory alignment. What the New Deal will look like is a credible path to a future Canada-style relationship, and that's the way that you're able to get it passed through Parliament.
Polly.
Well, the problem with Canada as a final destination is, of course, that it threatens huge tranches of our economy. But also because we repeatedly told the European Union that we wanted a closer relationship than that. And so none of what anybody said in the last months or years changes the basic realities of how trade works, which is either that we have to have regulatory alignment with the EU, or we need to flex and have different regulations which enable us to allow, for example, US goods in.
Right. Well, let's go right back. And Helen, looking at what Stephen was saying, that in the end, what is going to go through is May's deal.
No, I don't think so. I mean, my company has run an awful lot of analysis on the numbers. And the problem, even as we look at the poker pieces here for the final hurrah or whatever may or may not come out in Parliament, is that the numbers still don't stack up. Every time you lose somebody from the ERG or the Spartans, as they call themselves, you might try and gain someone from Labour, but then they still have a huge issue with, you know, a Tory Brexit. And then perhaps you might get someone anti-Corbyn, but then you lose somebody on the other side. I mean, it just never quite stacks up to get the numbers through to get a deal done in Parliament. It could get a lot closer.
Stephen.
Well, I think the important thing is I don't think this Parliament will vote for May's deal unless it's after a no deal, right? But essentially, right, in terms of the contours of that deal, some kind of regulatory alignment, whether on the island of Ireland or on the whole of the United Kingdom, some form of non-regression clauses because of their fears of a Singapore on sea, that will happen, right? Those are the essential contours of that. Just as any US trade deal is going to have some measure of access to our agricultural markets, right? Those are the demands of dealing with those blocks.
Just be quite clear here. You know, Boris Johnson can't just suddenly call an election.
No, he can't, but it is a response to a no-confidence vote, and that's really the only tool that Remainers credibly have that they know they could deliver, and that's the way to deliver an election. And ultimately, we all feel that's the way things are headed. But I just want to come back on the point of this sort of it being less credible to deliver regulatory divergence. Actually, one of the things that we heard out of the G7 last week was that the European side is actually a lot happier now that the UK side is being less nebulous about that end state. They're making clear that the purpose of Brexit is regulatory divergence, and they appreciate negotiating with something firmer like that than something that's saying, oh, we could do anything after this.
Tell me, Stephen, what you didn't go for there was you didn't go for the idea that there would be a confidence vote. You don't think there will be a confidence vote?
I think, so everything is possible, but I sort of think that Parliament will succeed in doing something that blocks a Brexit, which means that you end up with the other route to an election, which is if the government wants one, it can get one. Yep. The opposition has to vote for it, and the government can always go for a one-line bill going, notwithstanding the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, the next election will be on the 17th of October 2022, or whenever.
What about the idea that Corbyn says, well, no deal, my price for the election?
I can't imagine them doing that because, you know, as Stephen says, for the opposition party to say, actually, we don't want a general election, we don't really want it right now. The Labour Party is in a difficult position, and I think there's the glint is in the eye of the Downing Street kind of planners that they think they can take down the Labour Party if there were a general election. But that, of course, is exactly what Theresa May expected when she called the 2017 general election. And the idea, what Stephen was saying, this narrative that I can take on the Remainers, I need a mandate in order to deliver the Brexit that I promised. That's literally what Theresa May said in 2017. Boris Johnson is a better campaigner than her, but to assume that he is capable of delivering a majority, when we've talked about headwinds in Scotland, for example, I think it's incredibly reckless of them.
Well, thank you all very much. We'll be looking back on this in about 6 days' time. That's all we have time for. Mark is here tomorrow. Until then, good night.